Hi, welcome to the first video for our online summer course, Anthro 103, Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. First, we're going to ask the question, what is anthropology? Now, obviously, there's a lot I could say about this topic, and we'll be discussing it all semester. But to get you started, I wanted to tell you about the four subfields of anthropology: biological physical, archaeology, cultural social, and linguistic. And what I think is an easy way to introduce these is to talk about them in terms of the questions or the main question that each subfield asks. So for biological physical anthropology, the main question is, what do humans share and not share with other animals? This is the area of anthropology that's concerned with human evolution and with figuring out at what point in our history did we become human. And what does that mean exactly? When did we become Homo sapiens? Now, obviously, we could answer this question in a lot of ways, but anthropologists choose to answer it in large part by using scientific methodologies that look at non-human primates and other animals, that study, what they eat, how they interact, what kind of violence they enact against each other, what kinds of rituals they seem to participate in, and to sort of figure out from that how much we share in common with these non-human animals. Now, biological physical anthropology is also interested in human biology and what we share biologically with each other. This is an interesting area where anthropologists talk a lot about race, which for the most part we believe is socially and culturally constructed, but we're also interested in, again, looking at the human as a body, as a biological body, and what does it mean to be human biologically. The second subfield is probably the one you're most familiar with because of Indiana Jones and other movies, and that's archaeology. And archaeologists ask, what do living humans share and not share with past humans? So you're probably pretty familiar with this methodology. One of the main ones is the archaeological dig. So finding material remains from the past and trying to use them to understand when in human history we developed certain things like religious belief, or when in human history we began to live in a certain way and organize ourselves a certain way. When did inequality come into the human record? These are the kinds of big questions that archaeologists ask. And again, they'll use archaeological digs. They do a lot of lab work, a lot of statistical analyses. For example, one branch of archaeology looks at human remains to try to understand what humans were eating during that time period, and then they can use other information to figure out where humans got that food. And if that particular kind of plant was not available in their area, then they can make some assumptions about trade networks and how humans were able to get a hold of certain kinds of foods through trade networks. The third subfield is the one we'll be spending the semester on. Americans tend to call it cultural anthropology. The British tend to call it social anthropology. And it asks the question, what do living humans share and not share with each other? So, biological physical anthropology tells us we're all the same animal. Archaeology tells us that today we're living in the same period of time technologically and otherwise. So we're all the same human. So why do we live in so many different ways? Why is it that I feel disgusted at the thought of eating a termite, yet there are people in the world who think a termite is the most delicious delicacy they could possibly imagine? Why do we dress so differently? Why are our religious beliefs so different? Why do we organize ourselves differently by families? But at the same time, we like to look at how similar we are. So how can we look across societies and see similar political organizations, similar social organizations, similar ways of reacting to conflict, and so forth and so on? So we're really looking at people today and how they compare and contrast with each other. And our methodology tends to be ethnographic field work. You'll be learning very soon about what ethnography is, but basically involves, living with a group of people and trying to participate in their lives as much as possible while asking them questions and carrying out other methods to try to understand why they do the things they do. The fourth subfield, linguistic, asks how have and do humans express themselves through language? So we could talk about a lot of things in the sort of biological, physical evolution area that people posit are what make us human as compared to other animals. And one of those is language. Now we're finding out a lot about forms of language used by whales, dolphins, chimpanzees, African gray parrots, and lots of other animals. So clearly, language in the human context, by that we don't just mean the ability to communicate, because other living things can communicate. But language is something that particularly allows us to be cultural, to share culture, to pass down culture from generation to generation, to plan for the future, to discuss the divine, and other things that seem to set us apart as humans. So because of the importance of language, it has historically had its own subfield. But more and more, linguistic anthropology has become part of the cultural social subfield. So for example, a linguistic anthropologist might go to a community of immigrants who speak let's say Spanish and English, and really do a close ethnographic study of how language is used within that context to denote social hierarchies, ways of interacting with the community, how those languages influence educational experience, and so forth and so on. So it's kind of like cultural or social anthropology, but really privileging language. All right, so those are the four subfields of anthropology. 60, 70 years ago, if you took an anthropology class with me, an anthropology professor, I would teach you all four subfields. So traditionally in the field, an anthropologist did all of these. But as you know, over time, there's been a sort of specialization trend in academia in general, and certainly anthropology. So now really an anthropologist specializes in one of these subfields. So I'm a cultural social anthropologist. It would be hard for me to teach an archaeology class or a biological physical anthropology class. In our department at Gettysburg College, we offer cultural social anthropology and archaeology, lots of classes in those subfields, and we touch on linguistic anthropology and biological anthropology in a couple of our electives. Okay, so that's the four subfields of anthropology. There are a couple of other things I want to tell you about anthropology at this point, and that is that it strives to be holistic. So anthropology looks at the whole picture of culture and not just at the details. When I was an undergraduate like you, I had a really hard time picking a major because I liked everything. I liked literature, I liked religion, I liked history, I liked politics, I didn't really like economics. I tried, but it was hard. I liked everything. And I ended up being a history major, which was fantastic. But at the time, I didn't know about anthropology. If I had, I would have chosen it because anthropology says you don't have to make a choice. Because when we study humans, we have to study all of those things. So anthropology looks at how culture works as a whole. And so we can't understand family organization without understanding religion. We can't understand politics without understanding economics. We can't understand a particular ritual unless we understand the history of how that ritual came to be. So an anthropologist wants to look at the whole picture of culture and not just at the details, just as anthropology as a field is holistic in that it looks at the past, the present, it looks at language, it looks at culture, it looks at biology, and so forth and so on. The second aspect of anthropology is that it is comparative. So as you can see in these questions for each subfield, they're comparative questions. We can't understand one culture without comparing it and contrasting it with another culture. We can't understand the future unless we understand the past. So anthropology is always searching for similarities and differences between human groups and cultures. And that's really only possible through comparison. So we'll often hear people say, oh, Americans are so individualistic. Well, what does that mean unless you contrast them with a society that's less individualistic? So comparison is very important. And even now, like for example, as a cultural anthropologist, I did a lot of research in Morocco. I wasn't explicitly comparing and contrasting Morocco with other North African societies or other Middle Eastern societies or other Islamic societies, or with societies across the world and outside of all of those cultural categories. But the comparisons were implicit. I was making sense of Morocco based on what I knew about other societies. That's a natural tendency, and it's a helpful tendency in anthropology, but it comes with a warning. And that warning is that it's very hard to compare and contrast without making a value judgment. So when we're studying two different societies, or maybe we're studying one and we're implicitly comparing it with our own, we can't help but say, well, this is better and this is worse. This is more modern and this is more traditional. This is more patriarchal and this is less patriarchal. This society is more self-sufficient and this one is really dependent on others. And so much of the method of anthropology, which we'll be talking about shortly, is meant to help an anthropologist in the field make comparisons without making value judgments. And that's a very important and very difficult thing to do. Okay, so think about these. Think about what anthropology is. Think about what sounds interesting to you. Think about how you have studied other societies or the same society in different historical periods and what kinds of comparisons and contrasts that you have made. Thanks.